11. Beating down Brown. Traditionally, white Southern resistance to the Brown decision has been captured by images of violence that followed the Supreme Court decision. The angry mob of mostly white housewives hounding the traumatized 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford on September 4, 1957. Her first day of school at the once lily-white Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. The wreckage of Hattie Cotton Elementary School in Nashville, Tennessee, after it was bombed in wee hours of the morning of September 10, 1957. The day before, Patricia Watson had started first grade there as the school's first and only black student. There's also the Norman Rockwell painting of a disturbing scene that features pigtailed 6-year-old Ruby Bridges surrounded by towering National Guardsmen on November 14, 1960. They stride by tomato-splattered walls, further disgraced with racial slurs and KKK as they make their way to New Orleans' William Frantz Elementary School, once all white. None of that violence would have happened, however, and certainly would not have received the broader societal stamp of approval if the respected elements in white society, governors, legislators, U.S. senators, congressmen, and even more tepidly, the President of the United States, had not condoned defiance of and contempt for the U.S. Supreme Court and the constitutional provision that its decisions are the law of the land. In the North, where racial segregation was intense, the defiance was subtle but effective. In 1957, for example, Milwaukee's school board instituted intact busing that carried black children in overcrowded schools to white schools, kept them isolated in a separate classroom, and then ferried them back home again. The overt, even violent response to Brown did not occur in the North until much later, in the 1970s, most spectacularly in Boston. On the other hand, the Southern states made clear that they were ready for war from the get-go. The first step was to ensure that only those who felt threatened by Brown could vote. As Newman v. Bartley revealed in The Rise of Massive Resistance, by 1944, 10 years before Brown, only 5% of nearly 5 million, or roughly 250,000 blacks eligible to vote, were registered in the states of the old Confederacy. That left millions politically voiceless. As trying as it had been for blacks to register to vote before Brown, it became much more so after the ruling. Mississippi, for example, reinforced an amendment requiring superior literacy and an ability to interpret the state's constitution. Given that nearly 53% of Mississippi's black adults had fewer than 5 years of education compared with only 10% of their white peers, the emphasis on literacy and interpretation of a complicated legal document, while appearing race-neutral, was, in fact, targeted directly at black Mississippians. What's more, state authorities required blacks already registered to vote to re-register. These people faced the gauntlet of literacy tests, understanding clauses, and the whims of the registrar. That move alone caused the number of black registered voters in Mississippi, for example, to plummet by 2/3. As late as 1960, more than 98% of black Mississippians eligible to vote were not registered to do so. On May 31, 1955, the Supreme Court handed down an implementation decision, Brown 2. The High Court said that desegregation in public schools must happen with all deliberate speed. Segregationists remained defiant. Deep South states and Virginia added to their arsenals the discredited legal hocus-pocus of interposition, a state's claim to the right to put itself between federal law and U.S. citizens in order to stop enforcement of rulings with which the state disagreed. State Representative Sam Engelhard declared that interposition would serve notice on the rest of the nation that Alabama and the South will not accept integration. South Carolina's new governor, George Bell Timmerman, Jr., endorsed the unanimous legislative resolution that condemns and protests against the illegal encroachment by the central government on the state's sovereignty and against the grave threat to the constitutional government implicit in the decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States. Just as at Fort Sumter, where the Civil War started, the first shots were aimed at the federal government. If Georgia's legislature had had its way, the Constitution's 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would be repealed. It passed a resolution to petition the U.S. Congress to do just this. The Georgia legislature also wanted the Supreme Court justices impeached. As if its rebelliousness wasn't evident enough, on July 1, 1956, the Peach State adopted a new flag, one designed by segregationist John Sammons Bell. A Confederate battle flag took up 2/3 of the new banner. This flag flew above the state capitol until 2001. After Brown, white citizens' councils sprang up throughout the South. These groups were generally made up of middle-income and upper-income white folk. White citizens' councils had but one objective: destroy Brown. The Texas White Citizens Council issued the disclaimer, "We do not advocate violence or any form of illegal activity." In its mission to prevent school desegregation, it pledged to do so by any means at its command which falls within the law. The Texas Council dared to propose an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would require the Supreme Court to answer to Congress. Yes, they wanted to destroy the central concept of checks and balances in the Constitution. Yes, at a time when Southern Democrats had a stranglehold on both houses of Congress, the Texas White Citizens Council wanted to ensure that the Supreme Court would be at Dixie's beck and call. After such opening salvos came the shot heard round America. On March 12, 1956, Representative Howard Smith, a Democrat from Virginia, and Senator Walter George, a Democrat from Georgia, introduced the Declaration of Constitutional Principles before their respective chambers in Congress. This declaration, which became known as the Southern Manifesto, asserted that the Supreme Court had violated states' rights, abused judicial authority, and undercut the separation of powers. 101 members of Congress, all from states of the old Confederacy, signed it. Senator Lyndon Johnson, Democrat from Texas, was among the handful of holdouts. The Southern Manifesto signaled to the constituencies of its signers that massive resistance to Brown was not some base, primeval white supremacy, but rather a principled, patriotic stand to defend the Constitution. The Southern Manifesto sanctioned the use of the levers of government to defy the U.S. Supreme Court until, with the idea that the federal judiciary and black people would tire of the fight and Brown would simply collapse. The strategy's name was derived from U.S. Senator from Virginia Harry Flood Byrd's declaration to colleagues weeks before the Southern Manifesto was released. "If we can organize the Southern states for massive resistance to the Brown decision," said Byrd, "I think that in time, the rest of the country will realize that racial integration is not going to be accepted in the South." The game plan of stall and defy was now in place. Southern states used and abused the legal process to pass one unconstitutional law after the next. They knew that the process to overturn the statutes would be costly. But in the meantime, all the motions, hearings, affidavits, rulings, and appeals kept Brown at bay. Those extended legal battles allowed year after year to drizzle. During that drip of time, separate and decidedly unequal schools continued. Black children continued to be consigned to some of the worst education. Proud of the consequences, one man bragged, "As long as we can legislate, we can segregate." Indeed, by 1963, not one black child had attended a white public school in South Carolina, Alabama, or Mississippi, for example. Black parents stood up for their children, hauling states back into court. One of those states was Arkansas, where Elizabeth Eckford and 8 other black teenagers, the Little Rock Nine, braved the task of integrating Little Rock Central High in 1957. Black people were furious that rather than integrate, Governor Orville Faubus had shut down all Little Rock's high schools in 1958. The subsequent U.S. Supreme Court decision in Cooper v. Aaron was unequivocal. In Brown, the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment was the supreme law of the land and had to be obeyed, wrote Charles J. Ogletree, Jr., in All Deliberate Speed, Reflections on the First Half-Century of Brown v. Board of Education. Like Brown, the Cooper v. Aaron ruling only baited white officials in the South. In an amazingly wrong-headed interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, Arkansas argued that it was the state's governor, not the U.S. Supreme Court, who had the right and power to determine the law of the land. Governor Orville Faubus's Fort Sumter moment happened the minute that he closed the public high schools in Little Rock in 1958, and all the legislative machinery of privatization that had been previously holstered came out blazing. Between donations totaling more than $300,000, state funding of $176 per year per student, and taxpayer-subsidized busing to private academies, Little Rock had the means for most white children to remain in school, while the state simultaneously defied the Supreme Court by keeping blacks locked out. While white children attended those private academies, black children in Little Rock were without high school altogether, lamented Wilkins, the NAACP chief. This lasted for a year and is known as the Lost Year. The situation went from bad to worse in Upper South states, too. In Delaware, a district court ruling authorized a 12-year delay in implementing Brown. In Virginia, when local school boards in Charlottesville, Norfolk, and Front Royal were under federal court orders to admit black students, Governor James Lindsay Almond closed, in his words, every school threatened with desegregation in those cities in September 1958. In doing so, Governor Almond not only hurt black children, he shut out nearly 13,000 white children from getting an education. Pundits wasted no time, Jill Ogling Titus wrote in Brown's Battleground, in laying full blame for education disruption at the feet of NAACP agitators. School closures spread to now besieged Prince Edward County. Laws were passed to close the public schools, siphon tax dollars into private academies, and pay tuition for white students. Absolutely nothing was put in place for 2,700 black children. This would last for 5 years. The defiance of Prince Edward County was singular. No other school system in the nation remained closed for 5 years, 1959 to 1964, rather than comply with Brown. Only a small number of black families were able to send their children to live with relatives in, say, Boston, Chicago, or New York City, and have them attend school there. Those children were lucky. As for the rest, during those 5 long years, critical in terms of child development, most black children in Prince Edward County spent their formative education time in activity centers, that the black community cobbled together. The Baltimore Afro-American reported that these makeshift centers, some in basements, some in churches, others in abandoned shacks, staffed overwhelmingly by housewives and those with only a high school diploma, could not provide anything approximating an adequate education. What's more, these centers were open no more than 3 days a week, and for half a day at that. The curriculum was little more than a scant program of reading, singing, and discussion, said the newspaper. Once again, black parents, in one case with the determined fighting preacher Reverend L. Francis Griffin as the plaintiff, hauled Virginia back to court. But as the Washington Post reported, when such lawsuits hit, Prince Edward County supervisors simply denied that the Virginia Constitution requires the operation of public schools in any county. In the end, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down 2 unequivocal decisions that forced the schools to reopen. Even then, we read in Brown's Battleground, local and state authorities employed every weapon in their arsenal to ensure that the newly reopened system remained segregated, impoverished, and academically substandard. The most popular method of foot-dragging was the school board's freedom of choice plan. This ensured that white parents could move their children away from any school threatened with desegregation. The result was that by 1969, Prince Edward County schools were 98% black and, once again, starved of resources. Stall and defy had transformed into stall and undermine, but the results were the same, devastating. During the series of court cases swirling around Prince Edward County, a judge had noted that an interrupted education of 1 year or even 6 months at that age places a serious handicap upon a child, which the average one may not overcome. The federal government agreed, and in 1963 backed the privately funded Free School Association, which held classes in several of the county's closed schools, serving as an educational bridge to get the black children of Prince Edward County academically ready for when the public schools finally reopened. But it was too late for many children. Take John Hurt. He did not attend school during the 4 years of the closings, which began when he was roughly 9 years old, wrote Christopher Bonastia in his book Southern Stalemate, 5 years without public education in Prince Edward County, Virginia. When young Hurt finally went to a free school, it was just embarrassing to sit in a classroom and look at an assignment, unable to do anything more than write his name at the top of the page. He had 2 crippling words to describe himself: very dumb. The psychological devastation was equally debilitating and long-lasting. Henry Cabarrus recalled one of Prince Edward County's white officials declaring that he would rather his children be baked in the oven than go to a desegregated school. Cabarrus, 14 when the county's schools closed, was taken aback. When you have such strong white resistance against you as a person, he told the Washington Post in 2006, such that they can take away the most fundamental thing, education, if someone can take that away from you, your esteem is so small that you're always looking over your shoulder for who is going to attack or criticize. Prince Edward County is emblematic of the way that systematized racism not only destroys black lives, but also undermines the very strength of the United States. As thousands of black children were left behind educationally, the economy was beginning a seismic transformation that would require even more from its citizens. Factory jobs were rapidly disappearing. By the time Prince Edward County finally implemented at least parts of Brown in the 1970s, the heyday of industrial America, where gainful employment had not required a strong education, just a strong back, was already well over. The knowledge-based economy was taking hold. This new economy was primed for those who had had the benefit of years of good schools, and in particular, for whites who had a well-funded public school system that went all the way through the 12th grade and graduated the lion's share of them as college-ready. By contrast, countless black people who had suffered crummy schools and lapses in their education were now forced to face this cold, hard new economy with neither the necessary education nor technology-based work skills. It was not just Black America, however, that suffered the cost of this waste of human lives and talent. The brutally relentless